Welcome to I251 Learning Theories for Teachers. I'm Dan Hickey. I'll be your instructor for this course. I'm a professor with the Learning Sciences program, and I supervise this course for many other sections that are taught by associate and adjunct instructors. Just a little bit of background for this course. You may hear it referred to as P251. You may also hear about P254 and P312. This refers to three different versions of this course that were taught when the Learning Sciences program was in the Department of Counseling and Educational Psychology. When Learning Sciences, or LS as I will refer to it, moved into the Instructional Systems Technology Department in 2022, we elected to collapse these three courses into a single section. It was creating quite a bit of confusion, and instead we're using the different levels, elementary, secondary, and all levels, as a way to contextualize students' learning in this course. I'll start with some very basic advice on setting up learning routines to support your own learning about learning in this course. First and foremost, you want to manage your time wisely. A 3 credit course is approximately 9 hours per week. This is a fully asynchronous course, and so there's no formal meeting time. But you really should be spending at least 9 hours a week on this course, or you will get behind, and you do not want to get behind if you can avoid it. So you want to either know or learn your own learning strategies. When you're reading, remember to take breaks, keep hydrated, pay attention to topic sentences, conclusions. These are things that by now you're probably pretty familiar with. When it comes to writing, make sure that you fully understand the regular writing assignments in this class and that you note the due dates for all the writing assignments. You do not want to be writing at the last minute. You're also strongly advised to draft outlines for the more substantial assignments before you begin writing. Remember, learning is iterative and progressive. You want to live with questions, you want to revisit learning materials. You're going to be going over and revisiting things. It's going to take a while for some of these theories to sink in. As I'll talk about, these theories are complicated. They are not simple things. They will be new to many of you, to most of you. In particular, in this course, learning is about connecting. The assignments will really push you to make many, many connections with people, places, and topics and times beyond the course, but are relevant to the things that you're learning in the course. So let's start with a gentle introduction to some key terms that we'll be using this semester. Of course, we're going to start with learning. Learning is typically defined as a persistent change in what someone knows. Teaching, on the other hand, is the act of intentionally helping someone learn. The intentionality is an important thing there, and helping. Lots of learning occurs without teaching. You can think of many examples. The best example, perhaps, is language. Most human beings will become fluent in their native language, be able to speak their native language without deliberately being taught, simply by being raised in a family. Most individuals do not learn how to write in their native language without deliberately being taught. Someone needs to set aside and set up a routine for teaching them. Traditionally, this might have been parents, but if you think about writing, uh, most people didn't learn to write in their native language until the formal design of schooling, dating back, of course, many, many centuries. A key point to take away from this course is the difference between the processes of learning and the act of teaching or the practice of teaching. Many people conflate the two. By the end of this course, you should be perfectly comfortable describing the processes of learning without referring to the practices of teaching. Moving on to the term knowing, a measurable representation of something learned. Now, the measurable part, it's subject to debate. What does it mean to measure something, to say that someone really knows something? We'll learn a lot about that when we get to the topic of assessment. Before we go there, though, I want to point out that the very term knowing is theory laden. Knowing, as distinguished from knowledge, as you will learn, signals a more sociocultural way of thinking about learning. It's a relatively newer term. Traditionally, in cognitive theories of learning that we'll learn about, the term knowledge was used, and knowledge was treated more as a substance. Some people refer to this as the Cartesian model of knowledge. Using the term knowing in learned contexts is kind of a clue that someone is more grounded in these newer sociocultural theories of learning. Knowing implies more of a practice, whereas knowledge implies more of a stuff or a thing. Again, you don't need to learn this right now. I'm just introducing you to these things and giving you an idea of where we're going in this course. Behavior refers to observable action. You'll learn that behavior formed the centerpiece of the first round of sort of really scientific theories of learning. Development refers to the way that humans develop, and we often associate this with children and child development. More recently, people talk about human development and lifespan development. It all refers to qualitative shifts in knowledge or knowing. Fundamentally, development is biologically driven. But here's where things diverge. As we'll learn, Piaget, a leading cognitive theorist, insisted that development was fundamentally biological and the human mind uniquely unfolded in these levels of development. And until the human mind reached a certain level of development, you may hear them referred to as stages, that human was not capable of thinking at these increasingly sophisticated levels. Vygotsky, within sociocultural theory, argued that in fact that learning leads development. Learning, when defined as participating in social and cultural practices, the more that you learned, the more that the human mind developed. Again, we'll be revisiting these concepts, but in summary, this is a big difference if you think about it. If you assume that learning leads development, well, you're going to focus on sort of teaching and the development will follow. If you believe that development leads learning, you're going to wait until the human mind develops to a certain level before you teach them things. And to give you an example of the consequences of these theoretical shifts, in the 60s, Piaget was huge. People took Piaget for granted. And so you had Piagetian kindergarten readiness tests. Quite famously, where these were used, and they were used broadly in some communities, they often resulted in students from minority communities, from minoritized communities, or poorer communities being presumed to be less developed and therefore being held back from kindergarten. And what you had was entire generations of students who were entering kindergarten at age 6 and even 7. What that resulted in was 18 and 19-year-old college freshmen and a whole generation of dropouts. Well, if you go back and look at these tests of development, quite famously, one of them asked children to make an association between a teacup and a saucer. Well, what kind of a child would know that a teacup is associated with a saucer? Clearly, a more wealthy child. And in fact, many other children associated a teacup with with a soup pot because you'd use a cup for dipping your soup out of a pot because you didn't have a ladle. So that's just one example of the tremendous consequences that different theories of learning and development have had over time. Now, across the bottom, we reference context, social, cultural, and interaction. This is going to be a huge, huge distinction in this course. The extent to which you think that social and cultural context and interaction and discourse influence learning has an enormous impact on your theories of learning. So right now I'm going to introduce you to an example of one of the key ideas we're going to learn in this class, and that idea is iteration. Learning is iterative. It involves revisiting concepts. In the previous slide, we talked about the difference between theory and practice. I'm going to reiterate that by saying theories are fairly straightforward, as we see in the upper left. A leads to B. Practice is much, much messier. A doesn't necessarily lead to B, and theory is much more convoluted when it's considered in the context of practice. Let's talk about what a theory actually is. Generally speaking, a theory is a predictive set of ideas that's used to explain a particular phenomenon. It generally consists of concepts and principles. It's usually, but not always, accompanied by designed procedures. People will often ask, what is the learning sciences? Right? We're different than ed psych, and one of the differences about learning sciences is that our theories are fundamentally bound to practices. We don't really think about learning theories in the abstract, as is often seen in educational psychology and cognitive psychology. Rather, we really focus on design principles where we combine practices and learning theories. A learning theory is simply a proposed mechanism for how learning happens. We're going to talk about several things in this course that initially will probably be a little confusing. The first is, what is a concept? A concept is generally, but people will disagree, but it's generally considered a symbolic representation of an object. So a tree, a mile, a computer, those are all concepts. A construct is an idea that has no physical referent. An example is freedom or the idea of time. Right? You can't really refer to them very specifically. They're constructs. There's things that people constructed. I referred earlier to the difference between learning sciences and educational psychology. One of the key differences is that educational psychology is primarily driven by constructs. You'll learn some about these constructs: self regulation, self determination, intrinsic motivation. Those are all constructs. People came together and agreed that they meant a certain thing. Learning sciences, on the other hand, is primarily concerned with contexts. I focus a lot in my own research, for example, on the context of online learning and specifically about assessment in online learning. And I do my theoretical development in that context, and I draw from different theories that help me solve practical problems. Principles, on the other hand, are the expression of a relationship between two or more concepts or constructs. In the coming weeks, we'll be learning about what I characterize as the major Western learning theories. This distinction is important for a reason I'm about to tell you when I call them Western. Um, there are other theories of learning that are out there, Confucianism. Generally speaking, we're going to be immersed in theories that have come to the attention of Western cultures. In the early 20th century, we had behaviorism. Um, the classic example is classical conditioning. Pavlov's dog. You may have heard of Pavlov and his famous dog. Pavlov was actually he studied digestion, I think. Anyways, he learned that when they put meat in a dog smelled meat, they salivated at the smell of meat. There was this classical conditioning, and that you could train animals to make associations between things. Skinner came along later and developed a more sophisticated version of that sort of conditioning called operant conditioning. So these are the sort of classic behaviorist theories. Dewey, in the early teens, really was very, very radical for his time. It's people debate whether it's even appropriate to include Dewey under behaviorism because he was so progressive at the time. Um, Arguably, Dewey lost that battle, and at least in the West, operant conditioning under Skinner really prevailed until the 1950s. It was the scientific theory of learning. You did see in Germany in particular, in the 30s, a Gestalt theory that was much more in common with constructivism that I'm going to talk about next. The 60s, arguably the 60s, some say the 50s, but it's debatable. The so-called cognitive revolution. It's a little difficult to express how revolutionary these times were. Behaviorism was incredibly powerful. One of my professors, John Bransford, was a member of the very first class of cognitive psychologists. He literally was one of 5 people who got a first degree in cognitive psychology. Um, in the 1970s. And it was because when he started graduate school, there were no degree programs in cognitive psychology. They really put it together. By the time John finished his degree 4 years later, the field had exploded and behaviorism had largely been swept aside. It had largely been relegated to uh, learning disabilities and to sort of direct instruction and programmed instruction. But among scientific theories of learning, the cognitive revolution really uh, turned things around in a very, very dramatic way. Again, notice the arrow showing behavior is continuing. It didn't go away. It's still present. It's still relevant, but cognitive theories really ascended. You had information processing theory that really thought of the mind in the way that the early computers operated, uh, and which, in key respects, maintained key assumptions of behaviorism. Such as the idea that you should break content down into little small associations. And so that's sometimes called associationist theory. Schema theory, quite differently, focused on bigger, higher order schema and assumed that learning really consisted really of occurred as you built these bigger schema, making sense of the world. Bandura, quite famously, you may have learned about them in your high school psychology or other places, this idea of observational learning. And when we learn about Bandura, you'll be a little bit surprised how simplistic his famous Bobo the Clown experiments were. But these involved children learning to literally smack a knockdown doll um, by watching other kids do it. Behaviorism insisted that you had to be reinforced. You had to observe something, you had to do something, and then be reinforced. And Bandura proved that it was quite simple to demonstrate that much learning occurred from simple observation. Piaget, meanwhile, a Swiss developmental psychologist, um, really grew in influence in the 1960s. And this is constructivism. Uh, it's an important distinction here. Again, Piaget believed that learning led development. Pardon me, mistaken. That development led learning and had enormous influence in the 1960s, really through the 1980s. Arguably, educational psychology was the application of Piagetian constructivism to education. Seymour Papert, quite famously, had studied with Piaget and brought Piaget's ideas to the very early graphic computers. Papert was famous for inventing Logo, um, and the term constructionism still lives on and is very popular. You'll see when you hear about things like computational thinking, learning from scratch, a block based programming language. Those are all examples of constructionism that are still quite active and quite widely studied. Neuroscience came quite a bit later. A lot of the energy that went into cognitive psychology through the 1990s, for instance, when I was in graduate school, has now been directed at neuroscience. Most of the basic understanding about the way humans learn uh, in terms of their internal cognitive workings as a cognitive theory had really been established by the late 90s. Neuroscience that studies those processes at the very neural level really exploded after 2000 and continues to be a major source of investigation. In the 1970s, sociocultural theories emerged. Now, it's important to point out that Vygotsky died in 1934. His theories were not widely appreciated until the 1970s when they were first translated from Russian into English by a number of researchers. Uh, while they published this work under Vygotsky's name, there were actually translations and reconsiderations of Vygotsky's initial ideas. Um, these ideas in particular took shape in a very influential group of scholars at the Institute of Research on Learning. This was a think tank that was established in the late 1980s. Etienne Wenger and Jean Lave were among the early proponents of a theory known as situated cognition. We won't talk about situated cognition a lot in this class, but just be aware it's kind of a more radical and a more strident version of social constructivism associated with Vygotsky. Notice that it says situated cognition. You will hear the term situated learning, and this will be confusing. I guarantee you. You will see many proponents within more constructivist and constructionist theories talk about situated learning. They will make appeals, for example, to authentic learning environments, but they will still use a more cognitive theory of learning, but they will use situated learning to talk about instructional practices, right? So the term situated cognition implies that knowledge itself, or knowing, as I mentioned previously, is fundamentally situated in the social and cultural context in which it occurred. Michael Cole was one of the very early translators of Vygotsky, and along with Jerno Engstrom in Scandinavia, developed cultural historical activity theory, or CHAT, often referred to as activity theory. So those are just some very general overviews. This was a lot to cover. Frankly, if you're not a little bit confused right now, it's because you weren't paying attention. This was a lot to throw at you. We will be returning again. Learning is iterative. We will iterate through all of these ideas that I just shared with you. Thanks for listening.